The ocean first enchants you, then swallows you whole. They set sail with nothing but the hope of an unsinkable ship. But when the storm subsided, there was no ship left, nor the fragile beings we call humans. They took refuge on an island they thought was paradise, which soon turned into a silent graveyard. The ocean was both mankind's oldest enemy and oldest teacher. It had opened trade routes, shown adventurers the horizons beyond, but it had also buried thousands of bodies in its depths. In the final days of the 18th century, a medium-sized merchant ship sailing the middle of the Atlantic found itself right at the heart of this double-edged fate. On deck, the sailors were sweating as they wrestled with ropes, securing cargo crates and adjusting the sails on the masts according to the whims of the wind. The captain gripped his compass tightly, trying to keep the ship steady with stern and sharp commands. Everyone had hoped this voyage would be ordinary, even boring. But the sea always plays its own game. Man plans, nature laughs mercilessly. The dark clouds appearing on the horizon didn't catch anyone's attention at first. A slight chill, small, ominous ripples on the swelling waves. The crew thought it was just a change in the weather. But when night fell, the sky took off its mask and revealed its true face. Suddenly, the sky split open like a giant crack, torn apart by lightning. The thunder echoed through the ship's hull like a death knell. The raindrops fell as if bringing coolness at first, but soon began piercing the sailor's skin with the sharpness of a knife. The waves tossed the ship like a tiny toy, the masts creaking with a terrifying groan. The sails, meanwhile, hung like the curtain of death, ready to tear apart. Panic erupted as a huge wave washed over the deck from bow to stern. The men lost the planks beneath their feet and were swept into the sea. Their screams were drowned out by the roar of thunder. The captain shouted until his voice gave out, "Hold on to the ropes, lower the sails." But that voice was as helpless as a whisper in the roar of nature. The wooden hull of the ship creaked a little more with every blow. A mast snapped as if screaming its last cry to the sky and sank into the sea. There was only one emotion in the eyes of the crew: helplessness. Some prayed with trembling lips, others wept. The storm had merged the sky and the sea under a single black blanket. Direction was lost, even time had vanished. After hours of a life-or-death struggle, the ship finally lost its resistance. The waves shattered the hull. Planks scattered everywhere with a loud crash. People were flailing, clinging to broken masts and shattered planks. But the ocean was swallowing them all, one by one, with merciless patience. When morning came, the sun rose as if nothing had happened. The sky had turned a clear blue. The waves had calmed. But that tranquility made the wreckage left behind even more terrifying. Only a few people were breathing among the floating debris, their arms numb, their lips cracked from salt, their eyes fixed on the void. It was as if their souls had sunk with the ship. The survivors, by sheer luck, drifted closer to each other and clung to a broken piece of the raft. They didn't know how many hours or days had passed. Hunger and thirst had begun to gnaw at them from the very first day. Just as hope was fading, a thin, dark green line appeared on the horizon: land. They screamed and headed in that direction. With their last remaining strength, they flailed their hands in the water like they were rowing. When their feet finally touched the sand, they collapsed to the ground. The earth was wet, warm, and real. At that moment, they truly believed they had been saved. But fate had something in store for them. This island was not the paradise it appeared to be, but a silent executioner that would slowly consume their souls and bodies. At first glance, the island looked like something out of a postcard. Palm trees reaching toward the sky, golden sands, and turquoise waves gently lapping at the shore. Its appearance promised peace, yet this beauty was merely an illusion. The island existed not to sustain life, but to consume it patiently and silently. The castaways began to feel this truth more deeply with each passing hour. In the early days, panic and hope walked hand in hand. The survivors clung tightly to each other, comforting themselves with the thought, maybe a ship will pass by tomorrow. The sun painted the evening sky a fiery red, and this sight was the only thing that nourished the fragile hope within them. Believing that civilization still existed beyond the sea, far away, kept them going. But as the days passed, hope melted away quickly, like the last grains of sand in an hourglass. Hunger was first an uncomfortable emptiness, then turned into a sharp pain piercing his stomach. As his stomach gnawed at him, his eyes darkened, his thoughts grew heavy, and even the smallest movement became torture. Thirst, however, was a different kind of torment. Their tongues felt like stone, their lips cracked, and every breath felt like a burning knife cutting through their throats. The island was not generous. It was like a stingy master. The plants were either bitter or poisonous. Without rain, finding fresh water was nearly impossible. Most of the time, they had to drink from muddy puddles. Some fell ill from this, writhing in fever. But there was no other choice. The nights were even more terrifying than the days. Strange murmurs rose from the depths of the forest, animal sounds resembling screams, rustling combined with the wind. They tried to light fires, but most of the time the flames died out helplessly. Every night, as they tried to sleep on cold stones beneath a starless sky, there was one truth that seeped into their souls. They were alone. When hunger and fear combined, the human mind quickly deteriorated. Cracks formed between those who had once been friends. First came small arguments. Who drank too much water? Who came back empty-handed? Then these questions turned into fists. The fights echoing in the island's silence were actually harbingers of a much greater darkness approaching. Some of the survivors attempted to claim leadership. "Listen to me. We will survive," they shouted. But in a place where hunger reigned, authority was meaningless. It was no longer leadership that mattered, but food. People followed the crumbs of bread in their hands, not orders. One evening, as they sat around a small fire on the shore, one of them stared into the distance. The sun was setting, the sea turning blood red. The man whispered, "We'll never get out of here." No one answered, because the same thought echoed in all their hearts. As their minds clouded over, reality and fantasy became intertwined. Some saw banquet tables in their dreams, and upon waking, scooped up sand and put it in their mouths. Others claimed to see lights in the middle of the sea, but when their eyes turned to reality, there was nothing there. The island was rotting not only their bodies, but also their minds. And worst of all, hunger was no longer merely a physical pain. Eyes lingered longer on other bodies. When someone fell, it was not just a loss. It was also a sign of a dark possibility, a secret solution. No one had spoken it yet, but the same dark thought was lurking in everyone's heart. As the days passed, the island's silence grew heavier. Even the birds chirping disturbed them, for every sound only deepened their loneliness. There was no longer any friendship in their eyes, only suspicion and fear. People who had once stood side by side on the same ship now shuddered at the mere shadow of one another. And it was at this point that the island's true face was revealed. This was no paradise, but a prison that gnawed at the very essence of humanity. The survivors now had to battle not only nature, but also the darkness within themselves. Each new day distanced them a little more from both the world and humanity. The island was no longer just a piece of land. It was like a nightmare fluttering in sleepless nights. Days were like colorless shadows piling up on each other. Time itself had disappeared. There was no calendar, no clock. The sunrise had ceased to be a ray of hope and had turned into a harbinger of new torments. Each sunset felt heavier, more suffocating, filled with the whispers of fear from the darkness. Hunger was no longer confined to the stomach. It was drying up the veins, weakening the muscles, making the hands tremble and the steps chain. The lips were cracked by the salty wind. The throat had turned into a dry desert. When they tried to speak, the words came out muffled and incomplete. Silence had become a necessary agreement, for even speaking was now a luxury, a waste of energy. One day, one of them fell to the ground. He had been fighting hunger for a long time, but his body had given up. First they rushed around, searched for water, checked his breathing. Then silence. The man's eyes were fixed on the sky, but he could no longer see anything. Under normal circumstances, he should have been buried, but whose hands had the strength left to dig? The ground was hard, the bodies helpless. Eyes turned to each other. What no one dared say aloud was already echoing in everyone's mind. Their gazes lingered on the corpse for too long. Hunger had fallen like a heavy gravestone on their consciences. No one would remember whose move it was first. Was it a whisper or a shared glance? But soon, trembling hands finally closed helplessly over the corpse. First came fear, then shame. Then the instinct for survival shattered all human values. When the pieces of flesh were placed on the fire, they soon began to sizzle and cook. Only the crackling of the fire broke the silence. The flames illuminated their faces, their eyes gleaming with both greed and a bottomless emptiness. Every bite they took was actually a violation of humanity's limits, but they didn't stop. The rumbling of their stomachs drowned out the cries of their conscience. Not a word was spoken around the fire all night. The wind howled, the waves crashed against the shore. If one had looked closely at the faces, only one thing would have been visible: a terrible expression where guilt and satisfaction mingled. The next morning, nothing was the same. There had been a rupture. Some stared at the ground, trying to forget what had happened, while others remained calm, acting as if this were a natural process that was bound to happen. But that division silently severed the bonds. As time passed, the deaths multiplied. Hunger, thirst, and fighting claimed lives one by one. And each time, the same scene repeated itself. First silence, then glances, then the terrible decision. The human body had become food for the survivors. It was not taboo. It had become the only way to survive. The darkest point, however, was the normalization of this cycle. What began as trembling hands gradually turned into steady movements. The cries of conscience were silenced. Hunger gnawed at the soul, consumed it, destroyed it. Death was no longer met with fear, but almost with expectation. Sitting around the fire at night, the look in their eyes had changed. Now it was not only nature that threatened them, but each other as well. Who will be next? This question hung in the air like an invisible shadow in the smoke. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew. Survival might depend on someone else's death. Now the darkness of the island was coming from within, not from outside. It was not the shadows of the forest that were growing, but the shadows within people. These shadows were dragging them beyond even their animal instincts, to a point beyond human comprehension. And finally, the most frightening truth was revealed. Nature was not the enemy. The real enemy was the human mind, blinded by hunger. And just as man cannot escape his own shadow, he cannot escape his own darkness. The island seemed sworn to secrecy. Not a single cloud had appeared in the sky for days, and the sun continued to scorch their bodies with its searing rays. The number of survivors could be counted on one hand. Sunken cheeks, protruding bones, and the bottomless emptiness in their eyes made them resemble pale ghosts more than living people. Death had become part of the island's daily routine. One morning, a faint shadow appeared on the horizon, rising above the waves. At first, they thought it was a mirage, like the hallucinations of someone dying of thirst in the desert. They rubbed their eyes and looked again and again, but they were not mistaken. It was a huge ship approaching slowly, With its wooden hull cutting through the water, it was whispering to them the possibility of salvation. They tried to shout with joy, but their vocal cords had already cracked from thirst. Only hoarse whispers escaped their lips. Some fell to their knees, others were overcome with tears. But even the tears that fell were salty and stinging, as if they were the last drops draining from their bodies. Yet they all shared the same feeling in their hearts. Life was opening its doors again after a long sleep. When the ship docked, the rescue team stepped ashore. The sight before them left them rooted to the spot. It was hard to call these people human. Their hair was matted, their skin covered in scaly burns. Some crawled, some tried to approach them on their knees. But the most chilling thing was the emptiness in their eyes. Those eyes bore more traces of death than of life. One of the crew whispered, "My God, are these still human beings or just shadows?" The person next to him didn't answer. Words couldn't convey the horror they were facing. The rest were taken aboard the ship. They were given food and water, but most of them started vomiting after their first bites. Their bodies had become so accustomed to starvation that they couldn't tolerate normal food. Some trembled, some wept uncontrollably. But the strangest thing was that some remained silent. No gratitude, no joy. It was as if the roots of their emotions had long since dried up. As the island receded into the horizon, their eyes remained fixed on the shore. It was as if they had left something behind there. Perhaps a part of their souls, perhaps the shadow of their humanity. As the waves washed over the island, the feeling rising within them was not one of victory, but the cold echo of an approaching hell. When they reached civilization, a crowd greeted them. Journalists, officials, curious onlookers. Everyone asked the same question: how did you survive? But the answers were always brief and vague. Most remained silent. Some resorted to lies, because telling the truth meant returning to that darkness. And none of them wanted to live through that hell a second time. But at night, when silence fell, the nightmares returned. Some of them screamed in their sleep, shouting, "I had to. I had no choice." Others were buried in silence. When they closed their eyes, they still saw pieces of meat cooking in the red glow of the fire. Some clung to life. They returned to their families and tried to build ordinary lives. But ordinariness was gone. They pushed the meat placed before them at the table, unable to even stand its smell, their stomachs churning. As they looked into their children's eyes, the island's ominous memories came to mind. At that moment, love intertwined with a heavy sense of guilt, creating a deep void in their hearts. Some remained silent forever. They never spoke of those days, choosing instead to live in the shadows. But the lines on their faces, the emptiness in their eyes, left no need for words. Silence was their loudest cry. Years passed, but the island remained the same. Birds continued to fly. Waves continued to crash on the shore. Nature cared nothing for man's wounds. What happened was merely the tragedy of a few lives. But in the minds of those who survived, that tragedy continued to echo for a lifetime. And that is why the event, recorded in history books as merely a shipwreck, actually carried a much deeper wound. Because nature can sometimes be hostile, hunger can consume the body. But the greatest threat is man's own darkness. Once awakened, he never truly sleeps again. If you've watched this far, thank you, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Subscribe to make sure you don't miss out on more.